Welcome, everyone, to another episode of DigiChem Dialogues. I'm your host, Jay Bhatia, founder and CEO of Agilis. At DigiChem Dialogues, our goal is to bring thought leaders from the chemical industry to share their stories, insights, and perspectives on leadership, innovation, and digital transformation. Today's guest is someone I've been eagerly waiting to have a conversation with, and I know many of you have too. She is one of the most authentic, energetic, and creative leader I've ever met, Megan Gluth. Megan is the owner and CEO of Catalynt, a leading chemical distributor based in Seattle. She is also a trailblazer in our industry as the first ever female chair of ACD, Alliance for Chemical Distribution. Megan's work has earned her numerous accolades, including the prestigious Ernst Young Entrepreneur of the Year award in 2023. Megan, welcome to the DigiChem Dialogues. We are so thrilled to have you with us today. And we have got a record turnout for this session, and that says a lot about the impact you have had on the industry in a short span and your reputation as a leader.
Thanks, Jay. I'm glad to be here.
Great. So before I begin, I must tell the audience that you can drop. We will allow the last 10, 15 minutes. We'll leave it for Q&A. And I know many of you are eager to have questions to Megan. So please keep sharing your questions on the chat line. My colleague Derek is helping me compile those. So, okay, let's dive right in. Megan, your journey from growing up in rural Iowa to becoming the owner and CEO of a leading chemical distributor on the West Coast is truly inspiring and unique. Could you share your story with our audience, and how did your roots and experiences shape the leader that you are today?
Sure. That's a big question, and it's probably its own our podcast. I'll give you the highlight reel. Long story short, I grew up in rural Iowa, and I grew up well below the poverty line, which was actually kind of fortuitous for me in a lot of ways, because that meant that I was around a lot of people who had to be really resourceful and learned to be myself. And so I worked, I started working at a young age and developed a pretty good work ethic. And eventually, through many of its own trials and tribulations, I ended up getting a law degree in Minneapolis, and I practiced law for a little while in Minneapolis before I moved to the West Coast. First, when I moved to the West Coast, I moved to Portland, simply because I thought that it would feel more like a smaller town. But ultimately, I had family in the Seattle area, and I moved here. And when I was making the transition from Portland to Seattle, I made contact with several friends from law school to see if they knew some of the people or some of the reputation of the law firms that I was interviewing at in Seattle. And specifically, I asked, do you all know anybody that I can talk to about these places in Seattle? And I had one friend say, I don't know any of the law firms you're talking about, but I know a guy who has a business in Seattle that probably would know some of these people. He's pretty well connected. And I was introduced to Tony Ridnell, who of course was the original founder of TRI, the predecessor to Catalynt. And I met Tony, and he and I talked for about an hour. And ultimately, he offered me a job. And it's a silly story, and I could tell it at some point, but ultimately he offered me a job to be the company's first ever general counsel. And I said yes right away, which is interesting because I have no, my undergraduate degree was in history. I have no background in chemistry. But I thought the business sounded intriguing, and I thought it sounded interesting. And so I thought that I would do that for a little bit of time and then move on and do something else. After learning a little bit about how this industry worked. I was a lawyer alone for, a year and a half, maybe 2 years, before eventually I sort of worked my way very quickly to executive leadership, and I became the CEO of the company just a few years after I started. I learned quickly. I learned the business quickly, and I think that tends to happen when you're the company's attorney. You get involved very quickly in sort of the inner workings and the back room of how a business runs, and so I learned all of that really quickly. Um, And Tony was at a point in his career where he was getting ready to phase out. And I was at a point in my career where I was just getting started. And in 2019, I went to Tony and I said, listen, I have the full disclosure, guys, there's no rich uncles in my story. And in fact, my family is still an agricultural and working class family. I said, I don't sit on large stores of personal wealth, but if I can figure out how to finance this deal, will you sell me majority of your company? And then what we will do is over time, you can leave when you want and in increments and then retire. And he said yes to that because I think he was looking for what his exit strategy, what his succession plan was going to be. And he and I had worked super well together and had a good, really open and really authentic working relationship. And ultimately, what ended up happening is that he and I owned the business together for a year, excuse me, during which time we had the start of a global pandemic. And Tony at that time decided, okay, I think I'm done with this latest. I mean, the chemical industry, we can talk about this later, has these peaks and valleys. I think he was just done riding the ride, rightfully so. He had founded a business and had it go for 25 years. And I was ready to take on more of the challenge. So a year later, I purchased the remaining shares of Catalynt, or TRI at that time. And since that time, have made 2 acquisitions and then doubled, more than doubled the size of the business in terms of revenue, um, and frankly, all other measures of how we determine business growth. And so it's kind of an interesting, crazy story. I think if you had asked me when I was young if I had ever had an aspiration to own and run a chemical company, I would have not even known what you were talking about. But I'm certainly glad I'm here. Um, and as you know, I'm very involved in the industry itself. It's something I believe in. I think it's what I call the hidden economy, the backbone of how America makes things. And
Yeah,
so I'm very proud to be a part of that too.
right. Yeah, you're being modest when you say it's a crazy story. It's an amazing, inspiring story. It rarely happens. And I know many chemical distribution owners, and many of would love to get a hair or say, hand over the rein to someone like you, because if you build the business with your blood and sweat,
Hmm.
nothing is more satisfying than leaving it in the good hands to continue the legacy.
That's absolutely true.
Right. So that is fantastic. In your recent interview with Dave Crenshaw, you talked about human-centered capitalism
Yeah.
and mentioned the importance of letting things happen rather than intervening. That is fascinating to me, and it feels counterintuitive for many leaders because for ages I've heard leaders talking about intervene and change the outcome, take initiative. So this, could you elaborate on what you mean by not intervening and how this approach has shaped your leadership?
Sure. It helps to sort of put it in the context of what I mean when I say human-centered capitalism. I am 2 things. I am a fierce and devoted capitalist. So I'm not ashamed of the fact that I want to run a for-profit corporation. I want to make money. And I think American enterprise is the leading edge of the way we change the world, we transform the world, and we move into the next century. I think if you give people the opportunity to create and profit from it, you will see invention, you will see innovation, and you will see all sorts of changes that benefit all of us.
Yeah,
Inherent in that is the fact that we need to look at the people and the parts that are building that as humans. And that means that there's mistakes. So put in its most, the stories that are the most notoriety, how many times did Thomas Edison fail before electricity was invented? There is a sense as a business owner where you want to, or as a business leader, where you want to jump in and intervene in something. But I have found that very often, if the moment allows for it, and most moments do, most things are not as urgent as they might appear, where we can back up and we can allow the people who work for us to utilize their strengths, their gifts, their own ingenuity, and their own mistakes to find an answer or a solution that maybe we as leaders wouldn't have actually thought up that's actually better. My goal is to hire people that have, I always say I hire for that thing you can't teach. I'm not interested in anybody's resume. I'm not interested in their background. I actually don't really have much regard for that, except for the people. Obviously, if you work in my lab, I need you to have a chemistry degree or, some things like that. But even still, by and large, what I'm finding is that if you hire people with the right set of the skills you can't teach, they're people who are persistent, they are people who are resilient, they are people who have some grind and some grit and some hustle. When they are presented with challenges, they will find answers that are usually better than what I could have found or told them to do. Now, listen, when it comes to matters of compliance in our industry, when it comes to matters of safety, this isn't a thing where we allow people to mess around and do it wrong. But there are places where some of our processes and some of our procedures and some of the ways we've been doing things for 50 years maybe aren't the most efficient and maybe aren't the best way to do it. And the way we find that is by people working to find their own solutions and very often finding the solutions to their own mistakes. And so I tend to back off and let that work its way out and then and see what comes of it. And I would say that 9 times out of 10 what comes of that is something really really cool and a solution I wouldn't have originally thought of.
Right. Well, as a fellow entrepreneur, I can totally relate to what you're saying, and this is something very close to my heart. I also believe in the same that hire people for their attitude, not so much for skills. Skills can be taught, attitudes cannot be taught.
That's right.
And I also tell my team that, for all over decades that I've spent in corporate, we always hear that people are the most important assets of any business. It is it is so true. It is nowhere it is more true than a small business where you're starting from scratch and building something new. And I'm also so blessed to have those people with the right attitude who have helped me build a successful business.
That's
So I
right.
totally agree with you. Not intervening is the virtue that every leader needs to cultivate. Resist the temptation to intervene and guide, and because
That's right.
if you keep intervening and advise people how to do it, then you will get the outcome that you would have got, or maybe 80% of that. But if you let
Yeah.
them do their way, people will surprise you.
Well, and high performing people don't appreciate being micromanaged.
Exactly.
So, if you want high performing people working for you, then you have to let them perform and sort of in some sense get out of the way. And I found that that yields better results most of the time.
Right. Fully agree. So you've been a huge inspiration for women in the industry. You've made your marks in a chemical distribution. Let's face it, is a man's world. So, as the first female chair of ACD, what changes or initiative do you champion to increase women's participation in leadership roles, both in ACD as well as across the chemical industry?
To be honest, I feel like the ACD as an organization does an amazing job at that. And I mean, the ACD is led by Eric Beyer and working, he will tell you, just as cooperatively and in such tandem with Lucinda Schofer, who is the chief operating officer. And literally, the two of them have a dance they do together of equal power and heft and weight. And so I think we already see that within the ACD as an organization. There's a number of incredible women leaders, even just within that organization.
Right.
When you branch outwards, my goal in my life and in my business has always been to just show up in a room and be authentically who I am and do a good job.
Mhm.
We spend a lot of time right now, culturally, having this conversation about DE and all of these things. And I wonder sometimes if we aren't going down a rabbit hole of intellectualizing something that I feel is intuitive to most really good people, which is to say this:
Right.
there are all sorts of talented people in the world, and they
Mm.
come in all races, ethnicities, creeds, genders, all of it. And our goal as leaders should be to employ the very best of them.
Right.
And if we are doing that, we will not be able to help but to hire women, but to hire people who have a different religious background than us, that are diverse in what they offer us in so many ways, including their mindsets, their worldviews, their life experiences. And so I think that what's been really good about shining a light on issues of sort of the gender disparity and things like that in the chemical industry is that we now are looking, maybe we're seeing some of the talented women in the room that before we didn't notice as much, and that's really positive. And I think my role is just to be there and to be authentically myself, and yes, I happen to also be a woman, but I'm a really passionate advocate for the industry, and that's why I'm here. I think
Right,
that it sheds a light on what people should be looking for. And the
right,
question that I always pose to people is, have you been used to seeing the same thing so much that you're not necessarily looking at everything else that's in the room that's
mhm,
there to be offered to you? And if
mhm,
that happens to mean that you're so used to seeing men in leadership that you aren't noticing all of these women within your company that are really actually exceptional and are promotion material, like maybe you start looking at some of
mhm.
that. But I am not an advocate, and I'm not saying that you promote somebody simply because they are a woman. I'm just
Right,
saying that maybe what we ask ourselves to do is to open our field of vision a little bit further than what has always been shown to us. I
right,
also want to say that there has been in this industry for a long time a lot of really effective and powerful women leaders. And
right,
again, the question is, they're in your midst already, so maybe it's just relevant to start seeing them and start um, noticing that they've been there, and they have something to show us too about what they've been doing.
right, right. Yep. Let's shift gears to business.
Yeah.
So, this is your first year as a chairperson of ACD. So, what are the key priorities for you in 2025, and how do you envision driving meaningful progress for the organization and the members?
Well, what's been really interesting for me is that the start of my chairmanship is also the start of a brand new presidential administration.
Yeah,
And so whether you voted for Donald Trump or not, what is becoming clear to us is that that is going to present a lot of opportunities and changes and impacts to our business.
right,
And we don't know today. I mean, we're recording this on the 28th of January. He just was inaugurated last week. Like, we don't exactly know what all those things are. But what we do know is that we are hearing a lot of rhetoric and a lot of dialogue around the idea of reducing duplicative and sort of overindulgent regulations that stifle business more than it achieves the means or the ends that the legislators and the people who wrote it intended. So, for example, if you have three agencies that are all saying the same thing, and there's three different regulations and three different auditors and three different regulators, could we, as an alliance, help participate in educating some of these agencies and some of these legislators about how this works in practical terms in our businesses? And can we help shape and craft sort of sensible reduction of some of these regulations and inform them and educate them without dropping any standards for safety, which, as you know, in the ACD is the highest priority above all else. We came together originally in our formation to make sure that we have a set of standards so that our work and our industry is safe. So that's a priority for me, helping to shape, influence policy, inform government leaders, educate them, and ultimately, I would love to see the creation of some MOUs and some formalized agreements between our alliance and these agencies, such that it's a back and forth dialogue where we can help them and they can help us.
yeah,
In addition to that, I think we have large priorities in continuing to educate our membership, helping our membership stay on top of what all of these new things mean to them. The majority of the membership at ACD is small businesses who may not be able to afford their own internal compliance departments, things like that. So the ACD is now and always has been a really robust resource for companies like that. And we expect to continue that. And I think the Trump administration is certainly keeping them very busy in writing white papers on what this means and what's coming next and how to comply and what to do next. And we're certainly going to continue being as fully valuable to the membership as we possibly can.
right. I really like that Ask Consulting initiative
Yes,
uh, Eric and team launched last year. I think
yes,
this is a step in a so right direction because the small businesses need this help.
that's right. And they need help from an agency or an organization or an alliance that totally understands what they're doing, like entirely understands what the chemical distribution industry is and what challenges they face.
Right, right. With the expansion of ACD, how is it changing? Because at the last annual meeting, we saw a lot of new faces, and that is a good thing for the
Yeah.
community in general.
Yes.
Um, and what's your perspective? How will it change the ACD's agenda going forward? How will it impact the other
I
members?
think the ACD is being responsive to an industry that's changing.
Right.
And thus the alliance has to, by default, change with it. I think maybe 20 years ago, most of our members would have said that they were chemical distributors. And
Mhm.
now, I mean, if you look even at my company, we do chemical distribution, but we also have a blending, tolling, contract manufacturing facility in the middle of the
Right.
country. And so we are also, in some sense, doing work outside of traditional distribution. We're not
Right.
alone in that. I would say that most of my colleagues are bringing value added services like freight services, warehousing services,
Right.
all sorts of things like that. Increasingly in the past couple of years, we've been called upon and asked to be almost financial providers in some sense. I have a lot of Fortune 500 companies that came and said we don't want to keep any inventory on the floor and we're going to need much longer payment terms. And so I think we're seeing that element of what it is to run a business in this climate too. And so our membership is changing and what we're
Mhm.
being asked to do and what we're being asked to provide by our customers and by our suppliers is changing. And so by default, the alliance needs to have membership categories and have resources to hit all elements of that. It's part of the reason for the name change. This is
Right.
to say everybody that's involved in the value chain of distributing chemicals, handling them in some form, needs to have a place where they can go and be informed and be connected and be networked and work with other people who can be a resource to them. And so I think
Right.
that's why you see that and you'll continue to see that. That's the evolution of the business.
Right. I think you already summarized how the chemical distribution is evolving. It's no longer about just storing and moving chemical products. It's providing value-added services, getting into formulation, toll manufacturing, financing, managing inventory.
Yeah.
The other big shift that is happening in the industry is the avalanche of demographic shift.
Yep.
More with 75% of the industry workforce is expected to be millennials and Gen Z in the next 4 to 5 years. How do you see this transformation will impact the chemical distribution space, and what opportunities and challenges will it bring?
Yeah, I think um, we've known this was coming, right? If you come to the ACD annual meeting every year, you're treated to hearing the economist from ITR talk about this generational shift and this demographic shift. So
Yeah.
what you have is this happening in multiple layers. Number one, existing ownership is getting to a point where they're selling businesses, and so we see a lot of M&A activity and things like that. And then you're losing some of the through retirement, a lot of what I would call like the older, more senior members of management and staff leaving. And you're right. This also means then that 70% of these companies are going to have millennials and Gen Z working there. This is good for two reasons. Number one, that concept of innovation and sort of fresh eyes and new ways of looking at things that are reflective of the I tell people all the time when I graduated from high school, I didn't have internet at my home. It was
Mm.
there was two computers that were a dial-up situation in a lab at the library at school. And when I went to college, we all got email addresses, but nobody really used them. And the lab was at the end of the hallway in the dorms, and people didn't really connect. I mean, again, we were still doing dial up and things like that. And so my worldview and the way that I lead and the way that I look at solving problems is going to be very different than somebody who came 10 years after me who had a cell phone when they graduated, right? And so that is the introduction of fresh ideas and an introduction of new ways of solving problems and maybe being more um, efficient in some ways than we were. The
Right.
challenge to that is that in this industry, there are some things too that are timeless and have to be done in sort of what I'm going to call the old slow way. And there's nothing wrong with that. And we have to balance those two things. In this industry, when something is not going right with a product that we deliver, we're not in the kind of business where they can file an online claim and wait for us to get back to them 24 hours later. If
Right.
something is going wrong in the chemical industry, it requires a human being to attend to it immediately. And so
Mhm.
there are parts of what we do that are more traditional and more timeless. And so we will need to use the older voices in the room to educate the younger voices about how to do that appropriately.
Right.
And then there are things that we can modernize and shift, and we will need the younger people that are coming in to educate and train some of us who maybe are a little more, I call myself like a self-proclaimed Luddite, but need to move some of us in a little more technologically advanced way. So both things will have to work in tandem in this industry.
Right. That is so true. Now, AI and digital technology are shaping industries at unprecedented pace across the multiple industries. So how do you see these advancements impacting chemical distribution space, and what steps you think chemical distributors should take to stay competitive and be future ready?
Sure. I think first and foremost, I think AI, not just in the chemical industry, but in all industries, is going to help us solve immediately a lot of the problems we have with labor shortages. I mean, this is one of the things we knew was coming, and it is it's the elephant in the room for a lot of my colleagues that I talk to. The hardest thing they have going on is finding people to work in the jobs that they have. And so I think AI and other technological advances are giving us the opportunities to have a machine do what people used to do. And
Mhm.
so at its most basic level in the chemical industry, you would give those tasks to AI, which are not likely to be safety related. So maybe we're looking at online order processing. Maybe we're looking at um, an automated system for how we get documents to customers and some engagement on billing platforms and things like that, what I'm going to call like the administrative work. And I think that's the way we'll start to see it come into the chemical industry. However, I also know that we're working on using artificial intelligence for things like inventory management, tank monitoring, um, and then eventually we talk about technologies like driverless trucks and all of that kind of thing. And all of that will come in its own time. But in its most immediate case, I think what you're starting to see is people using these kind of advancements in technology to streamline some areas of their business where the risk of something going wrong is low.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, look, the chemical industry has a big responsibility. These are hazardous regulated products. So anything we do has to be done with a great responsibility and compliance.
That's right.
So it's not going to be revolutionary, it would be evolutionary.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. And I think in order for the industry to take advantage of this technology, first and foremost, the industry players needs to organize their and digitize their data, be it a
Yeah.
product data or customer data or transaction data. Because if your data is not digitized, there is not much AI you can use. So given those two massive forces, the demographic shift, changing customer preferences, employee preferences, and then the new technologies that offers great opportunities. Despite that, why digitalization is often feels like a nice to have for many chemical distributors. At what point you think it will become a must have?
I think that's a question that can only be answered by each individual business owner. But I would say that in a general rule, what I see for a lot of companies when they're in the must have is when they no longer can staff and no longer can have individual humans doing each step of this. So you talk about, put data organization and getting that to a system where then you can have a machine again sending out your invoices for you and telling you when it's time to reorder something in stock and all of that kind of thing. I think eventually we're going to lose the ability to have a class of workers that do that for us, and at
Right,
that point you will be at a place where you need that. And so my advice is always to start working that in before you're in the place where you have to have something and then you don't really
right,
know how to use it, and you don't really have it becoming part of your day-to-day existence.
right, right. So speaking of preparation, how is Catalynt, your business is positioning itself to navigate and leverage these trends, and be it a demographic change or technological advancements?
So we already look at ways that we can, I bring up having a software system that tells us when it's time to order. So at our plant in the Chicago area, obviously, we're making different products and we're making different blends and we're doing things for customers. And so now we can have technology tell us when we're running low on one of the key component ingredients of a blend or when it's going to be time to reorder, and it helps us manage inventory management, frankly,
Mhm.
for us at not only like a batch level, like obviously now there's software that helps us create formulas, and then uh, this software will tell the people who are making the actual product how much of everything they need. This is all part of a computerized system now, and so we know we're getting it right. So we're doing that already. Where I think we I would say that we're still also very careful to double check and triple check. Full disclosure, like I said, I always I have a saying, measure twice, cut once. And so we still have policies and procedures and systems in place to make sure that the machine got it right, if that makes sense. And so for us, I think it will take some time before everybody is like, okay, this machine gets it right. We know we're doing okay. And we're probably always going to check that, just because also we're subject to so many regulatory agencies that the cost of getting it wrong is too high. But I
Right,
think for us, this is the way we're starting to do that. And again, that's a task that used to be done by a human,
right.
that now we might take that same human and say, okay, we need her working in our finance department, not sitting here doing the calculations for what ingredients go into this batch. Her time is better spent doing something else that we really need. And now we have a machine that can do that.
That's a pretty cool application.
It is. It is.
So, talking about the demographic shift, how do you think we can make this chemical distribution more attractive for the younger generation and to close the talent gap in the industry?
I think to start with, we have to have a conversation in our culture. We have a lot of when we talk about science and technology in modern day culture, a lot of young people think about computers and think about computer science. And I even look at the young people that are in my life. They want to design video games and they want to make an app and all that kind of stuff, and all of that's really good and really beneficial. But I think we need to be part of the conversation, saying that it's still, some of the old school sciences are still so relevant and so necessary. Chemistry is worth studying. Being a chemist in a lab and doing that kind of work is important, and you're contributing to society and explaining some of the cool things that you can be a part of. I think as an industry, um, we are all sort of modest, and we're all working so hard that we forget to say, hey, listen, we're participating in some really neat things. We know how everything in this country is made. If you walk into an ACD annual meeting and you talk to the people who are there for one day, you literally can learn how everything in the country is made. There are people in that room that are helping make wood varnish, that are helping make tires, that are helping make suspension fluids for vaccines. Like everything in that room, every person in that room is contributing to something really cool. And I think we need to have a conversation about manufacturing, about what I call the hard sciences, the
Uh,
chemistries, the biologies, um, of the fact that everything that you interact with, even the chips for the computers that you're working on, is made using the ingredients, that the coating that goes around those wires is made at some of the facilities of the members of the ACD.
yeah,
And we have to remember that behind all of these things and these advancements in technology, there is a very real set of people doing hard work to make those actual hardware components. And I think we just need to do a better job of not being so modest and saying, hey, what we're doing here is really cool and it's fascinating. And if you're interested in this kind of thing and you like how things work, you should come be a part of our industry.
right, right. Yeah. Now it is fascinating. 96% of all manufactured goods are touched by chemical industry. And
Yes.
yet, it's amazing that so many people outside the industry, when I state this fact, their eyes pop out. Really? We
Yeah.
didn't know this. Yeah,
Yeah. I think people, when they think of chemistry or think of the chemical industry, they think of, giant stacks of hazardous waste. And
right,
again, listen, certainly some of what we do is hazardous chemistry, but the majority of what's happening is related to lotions and inks and dyes and paint that goes on the wall. And there's so much that people, to your point, don't recognize about how chemistry is touching their life, even what it takes to clean water so that you can drink it. We
Right.
forget about that.
Right. All right. Let me ask you a personal question.
Sure.
So what's the secret of your energy? You're always energetic.
I'm very I have a very strong belief that I am a collection of cells ultimately that require tending to have high energy. It
Right.
is my intention and my purpose every day to get up and to be in a state of frequency that generates, that builds, that motivates, that inspires. And so, in order to do that, I am very diligent about what I do to take care of my body, what I put
Mhm.
into my body, what I consume. I am a daily meditator. I have a meditation practice. I teach yoga on as my side job. And I have a daily yoga practice. I have a physical fitness routine. I'm careful with what I eat. I'm
Yeah.
also careful with what I consume mentally. I don't sit and watch a lot of the 24-hour news networks, and I'm very careful about where I go on social media and things like that. And I think we're starting to see that conversation happening more in the mainstream. But I think I tell people I was doing that before it was cool, um, because I'm careful and I'm cautious with what I'm consuming because I know what my intention and what my purpose is, and I have to be very careful that I don't let things knock me off of that. Um, when you do that, when you take care of yourself, you just naturally have like a vibrancy and an energy that you can move in the world with. And I'm living proof of that. I think I do that. And a lot of the people that I look up to the most that have the most energy for life and zest for life are people who live in a way similar to me. And that's not to say that I don't enjoy an ice cream sundae. My daughter made a plate last night of Rice Krispie treats, and I ate three. Like it's not about that, but
Right.
it's about just saying like I'm going to do things in general in my life that move me in a state of being that I want to be in.
Right. Yeah. Man, there's so many practices and thoughts we have in common. My day also starts with meditation and yoga.
Yeah,
I always watch out what I put in my body and mind. So
true.
that's wonderful to know. I think it's yeah, once you get in the habit, it's so simple, but
Yeah,
it's just getting in the habit is the difficult part.
it is. And once you get in the habit, you start to notice what happens when you don't, or when you do. I mean, there are moments where I go, "Ooh, I don't feel right," and I can pinpoint exactly why I don't. And then I tell people with any practice, meditation or otherwise, recognize you've fallen off and get back on. And that's the way I try to live.
Right, right. And this Dave Crenshaw, so you also talked about MVA, most valuable action. So
Yes.
tell the audience about it because I think that resonated with me a lot.
Yeah, I think Dave and I were talking about it in the context of, if I remember correctly, and I forgive me if I'm not, because I do a fair amount of podcasts, but we were talking about just sort of the most valuable action that you're taking in any course of your day or any course of a circumstance or a situation. And for me, in general, I find again, and it's not for everybody, but I do find that taking that pause and taking that ability to have a moment of meditation or mindfulness or whatever for me ends up being um, one of the most valuable things I can do in any situation. I said at the beginning of this, some things are not as urgent as we might make them feel. And
Right,
so taking a minute to just sit back and say, what's really occurring here? What's really happening here? I think is my responsibility as a person, but also as a leader, leading my people to think like that as well. So sometimes the most valuable action is no action.
right. All right, good. So I think let's get in a few questions from audience. So I have first one is not a question, it's a compliment from Julia Christopher. I love how you see the potential of people and your leadership style.
Thank you. Thank you, Julia. That's so sweet. Thank you.
And then a couple of questions. So the sustainability is a big driver. It's a business. It's not a driver. It's a business requirement, and it also sustainability can be a enabler of business. So how do you see chemical distributors are meeting those challenges and turning that challenge into an opportunity? How do
For
you
sure.
do anything specific at Catalynt?
Well, that's two questions. First of all, I will say that contrary to, maybe what might be like a common public opinion, nobody has led the world more in sustainability than the chemical industry. And the reason I say that is that a number of you who are listening currently work with chemistries that are made from byproducts of other production. A lot of people work with second stream recycled product. For a long time, the chemical industry has been saying, if we make A, we will get B. What can we do with B? And that is, I think, an unrecognized and unspoken sustainability move because we've been doing it since before it was popular. We didn't even realize that some of the way our businesses are built is completely sustainable. I think also that I like to remind people that we live in the communities we work in. And so we have always wanted to do things cleanly, with as little draw on the resources around us as possible. And so we've always been looking for ways to have, I mean, whether it's something as simple as going into a warehouse, 100,000 square foot warehouse, and now all of the light bulbs in there are the kind that shut off when there's no movement, or they're LED rather than the traditional fluorescent bulb. Like that kind of thing makes a huge difference for some of the scale that some of us
Mhm.
are working at. I do think that we are also leading the way with our supplier partners too in the creation of technologies and the creation of chemistries, individual molecules that are
Yep.
made from biofuels, that are made from feedstocks that are renewable. And I think that we are the ones that are trying to figure that out first. I do think that the gap exists. Um, right now, I think one of the biggest things you'll hear if you talk amongst people in the industry, and particularly on our supplier side, is that the investment in the R&D that it takes to do that has to be paid for somehow. And
Right.
right now, there's a lot of conversation about people wanting things to be sustainable without the will to pay for it. And
Mhm.
so the traditional molecule costs X and the green molecule costs Y, and they don't want to pay the Y. And so we have some work to do there and some ways that we can incentivize investment there. But I do think I've always said that this industry was doing sustainability and doing green long before it was cool. We've been looking for ways to make something out of nothing or out of waste for a long time. And part of that is the fact that we've been capitalists. And we need to
Right.
remember that our desire to innovate and create has been something that's created a sustainable situation for a long time.
Right. So true. Yep. Have one more questions from Andrew Gardner at Brenteg. Megan, how do you motivate your team and ensure your message is driven through your organization during the lows of low of the market downturn?
Sure. Um, Thanks for your question. This is something I think a lot about. So I always say that number one, it starts with me first. I have to make sure that I'm not allowing a market downturn to turn me into a pessimist. I really truly believe that if you turn on an economic report and you're told that the market is bad, and you believe that the market will be bad. One creates one's destinies from one's thoughts, and that's absolutely true. And so, what I encourage my people to do, I talk directly to them frequently and I set an example. And I talk a lot about our choice as a company to move forward with what we know we need to do, regardless of what we hear from outside. We spend a lot of time talking as a team about training our mind and being mindful about who we let speak into our business. And this
Mm.
is a conversation that I have. I'll have it tomorrow. We're going to have an all company meeting tomorrow. And this is a conversation we will have about choosing who we are, what we're about, what our objectives are, regardless of what the world throws at us. We know it's right and we're committed to that. And it's one of the core values of my business is being committed to that kind of thing. Ultimately, culture can be generative or destructive. And
Right.
it is my job. The buck stops here. It is my job to create a culture that is constructive and that has that energy of saying, all right, so it's an economic downturn in our business, if you've been in the chemical industry for the last 5 years, you will know that every negative, terrible situation has also carried within it the potential for some really cool business opportunities. The
Right.
people who went out and grabbed that were the people who assumed that because this terrible thing was happening, there was going to be opportunity. The people who heard this terrible thing is happening, woe is me, what am I going to do? They didn't go grab that. And so that's true in any business, but in our business, I really do find that it's kind of one of those unique industries where it's not like we're only making teddy bears. If the economy goes down and nobody's spending money on teddy bears, you might have a tricky situation and you need to completely reinvent yourself. But here we can say, all right, well, this segment of the market is going down. Where else is this molecule used? What else might this be signaling us to? Maybe they need a substitution to this. Like there's always some way to be looking for that. I train my people to do that. And we have internal competitions and things like that. We motivate and have fun around this idea of ingenuity and looking for that. But we mind our attitudes first. And it's the first thing we do, our attitudes and our mindset. Everything else comes second to that.
That's such a wonderful thought. Megan, this has been such an insightful conversation. Before we wrap up, do you have any message or any advice for the aspiring leaders in the industry?
Yeah, just keep going. Like, just keep going. We need you. If you have wild and crazy ideas, I almost think like the crazier the better. Like, this is the sciences, folks. Like, this is where people invent things that matter, that change lives. So if you are wild and crazy and have an idea, bring it, and let's all talk about that. Um, because I think that's how this is really truly like the places where we have engineered solutions to real life problems, and it was always people who looked a little bit insane, um, that were at the head of that. So if you're one of those people, keep going. If you're not insane and you're just ordinary and run of the mill, like me sometimes, like that's okay too. We need you. We need everybody swimming in the same direction together, and this industry provides more than anything else the opportunity to move forward. Whoever you are, there's so many different things to do in this industry, that there's a space for you here, and we need you and we want you to stay.
Thank you very much. Thank you once again, Megan, for joining DigiChem Dialogues. It's been an absolute pleasure to hear your journey and your perspective. And thanks, audience, for participating today. And we'll see you at our next episode.